Okay, so today we're going deep, really deep, into something that underpins, well, pretty much everything, right? Economics.
Yeah, it's kind of inescapable when you think about it.
And we've got this really fascinating article, What is Economics, that we're going to be dissecting, getting to the heart of it.
Absolutely. Should be fun.
And our mission here, I think, is to really distill those core concepts of economics, right? So that
Yes.
you, listening to this, can cut through all the noise, the jargon, the political spin,
Right.
and understand what's actually driving the economic events that you see every day.
Exactly. Because I think what's really interesting is that at its core, economics is based on some surprisingly straightforward principles.
Right.
And these principles are what we're going to be uncovering today. And the cool thing is they're not just relevant to, today's world or one specific type of economy.
Right.
They echo throughout history and across different economic systems.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating is like these fundamental forces are always at play. Whether we're talking about rising prices under like Alexander the Great.
Exactly. Or, thinking about something like rent control, why it tends to have, similar outcomes in cities as different as Cairo and New York.
Right.
It really speaks to something sort of universal about how economies function.
Okay, so let's jump right in.
Sounds good.
When we talk about economics, what are we really talking about at the most basic level?
Mhm.
What is an economy?
At its core, an economy is simply a system for producing and distributing the things we need and want, right?
Yeah.
Like the goods and services.
Right.
But the key thing that distinguishes an economy, that makes it an economy, is the element of scarcity.
Scarcity.
If we had unlimited amounts of everything, there would be no need to make choices, no need to economize,
Right.
no need for economics,
It would
basically.
be like a utopia or something.
Yeah, kind of like a Garden of Eden situation where everything is just abundant.
Right.
But, back here in the real world, we don't have that luxury.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Back here on Earth, things are a little different.
Yeah, a bit more complicated. So the influential economist Lionel Robbins, he put it this way.
Oh. Okay.
He said, economics is the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses.
Okay.
And that's the real crux of it, I think.
Scarce resources which have alternative uses.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. Let's start with scarce.
Where?
What does that really mean in the context of economics?
Yeah.
Because on the surface, especially in, many developed countries today, it doesn't always feel scarce.
That's a really interesting point. And it's true, for a lot of people, they might not be experiencing like absolute poverty or anything like that.
Right.
But scarce in economics, what it really means is that all of our wants and desires combined, like everyone's, always add up to more than the total resources that we have available to fulfill them.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily about like a lack of things in an absolute sense.
Right.
It's about the fact that our desires always outstrip the resources available. I see. The article actually brings up this New York Times article that I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
And it highlights the anxieties of middle-class Americans, people who, by many historical and global standards, are actually pretty well off.
Yeah.
Some even own swimming pools, things like that. But the headline of this article was just getting by, talking about wishes deferred and plans unmet.
So even with a swimming pool, you can still feel like you're barely making ends meet.
Right. It's this sort of paradox, right?
Yeah. Is it just a matter of poor budgeting then?
Well, it's interesting because the article quotes a Harvard sociologist,
Yeah.
and they refer to these individuals as budget constrained.
Okay.
But I think the real economic insight here is that it goes beyond just, personal budgeting skills.
Okay.
It's this fundamental constraint of reality itself. There simply has never been enough of everything to satisfy everyone's wants and needs completely at the same time.
So it's less about individual failings and more about this like basic truth of the human experience.
Yeah, exactly. It's like this underlying pressure of scarcity that's always there.
Right.
And the text actually shares this personal story about a woman named Geraldine Fraser
Okay.
who got her finances in order. She, tackled her credit card debt and everything.
Okay.
But she still felt this underlying pressure of potential debt. She mentioned that like one wrong move could send her back into financial strain.
Right. So even when you're doing everything right, that sense of scarcity can still loom large.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think that speaks to, the personal impact of this fundamental scarcity that we're talking about.
It's the reason we all have to make choices.
Right.
And be careful with what we have.
Yeah.
And this isn't a new problem, is it? I mean, scarcity has been around as long as humans have, right?
Absolutely. This need to economize, to make the most of limited resources,
Mm-hmm.
it's been a constant throughout human history across all societies,
Right.
regardless of their structure or how developed they are. And, a key point here is that this idea of unmet needs, that's not something that's unique to one type of economic system, like, is it capitalism or is it socialism?
Right.
Ultimately, these systems are just different ways of dealing with the same fundamental problem.
Right, those inescapable trade-offs.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've established scarcity as this fundamental challenge.
Right.
How do economies try to deal with this? It seems like just dividing up what little we have wouldn't get us very far, would it?
No, not at all.
That's where productivity comes in, I think.
Exactly. And, economics is not just about how we split up a fixed pie.
Right.
It's about how that pie gets bigger in the first place.
Okay.
It's about production.
Production.
How we take these scarce resources, things like land, labor, capital, and transform them into the goods and services that make up our standard of living.
Right, because the things we need and want don't just magically appear.
No, they have to be created.
Okay, so how do we make that happen?
Well, the text uses this really interesting comparison between countries that are rich in natural resources
Okay.
and those that have fewer resources.
Right.
And what's striking is you sometimes see this disconnect where countries like Uruguay, Venezuela, they have a lot of natural resources per person,
Okay.
but their average income is significantly lower than in places like Japan or Switzerland,
Right.
which have far fewer natural resources.
So it's not just about what you have, it's about what you do with it.
Precisely. The key is how wisely you choose to use what you have.
Okay.
That difference can be the whole story, the difference between struggling and thriving as a society.
I see. So the source uses this phrase, alternative uses. It's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Resources aren't locked into just one purpose, right?
Exactly. Think about something like water.
Oh, okay.
It can be used for drinking, for agriculture, for industrial processes, even for recreation.
Right. So many possibilities.
Or petroleum. Petroleum can be turned into gasoline, plastics, even pharmaceuticals.
Wow, I never thought about it that way.
Or iron ore. Iron ore can be used to make something as simple as a paperclip or to build a skyscraper.
So every economy has to figure out how to use these limited resources in the best way possible.
Exactly. And every economy constantly faces this question. How much of each resource should we dedicate to its various potential uses?
Right. Because there are trade-offs.
Always trade-offs.
And the text says that doing this efficiently is what economics is about. What does efficiently mean in this context?
Well, in simple terms, efficiency means getting the most value out of the inputs that we have.
Okay.
Different economic systems, they represent different ways of answering that allocation question,
Right.
and some are much better at it than others. The text gives this example of the Soviet Union. They were using way more electricity than the United States,
Okay.
but they were producing a much smaller economic output overall.
So even though they had all this energy, they weren't using it effectively.
Exactly. And that's a prime example of how inefficiency directly impacts people's quality of life.
Right. It leads to a lower standard of living, even if the resources are there.
Exactly.
So this idea of making the most of what we have, turning inputs into outputs, that's really crucial for how well society does.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to emphasize this point that the text makes. Economics, at its heart, is about these real things.
Yeah, okay.
The raw materials, the labor, the goods and services themselves.
Right, the actual stuff.
Yeah, money is just a tool. It's a way to facilitate those processes, a medium of exchange.
Okay.
But the real wealth lies in the goods and services that we're producing.
I see.
Printing money, it's like changing the units on a ruler.
Okay.
It doesn't actually make the table any longer.
Right, it's an illusion of wealth.
Exactly.
Okay, so the source also talks about some common misunderstandings about economics, like what it is and what it isn't. It's not just about like personal finance or running a business, right?
Right. While those things do involve economic principles, the field of economics is much broader. When economists look at things like prices, wages, international trade, they're thinking about how the decisions made within that system impact how we allocate those scarce resources we talked about,
Okay.
and ultimately how those decisions affect the well-being of everyone in that economy.
So it's more about understanding those big picture forces that shape our lives.
Exactly. It's a way of thinking systematically about cause and effect in those larger systems.
It's not just people's opinions. It's based on like real analysis.
Exactly. And, the text makes this interesting point that Even economists with vastly different political views, like Oscar Lange and Milton Friedman, they used fundamentally similar analytical methods.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, their disagreements, they often stemmed from different priorities or different assumptions,
Right.
but the core tools of economics, they were largely the same.
Okay.
It's just how they were being applied and interpreted that differed.
And when we talk about how people react to situations, the source also brings up this concept of incentives.
Yeah, and this is huge.
Right.
Incentives are at the heart of how economic systems work.
Okay.
It's not enough to just look at the goals behind a policy.
Okay.
We have to analyze the incentives it creates, right?
Right, because people respond to incentives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What matters most is the consequences, both the immediate and the long-term ones.
So even well-intentioned policies can have negative outcomes if the incentives aren't aligned properly.
Absolutely. And the text reminds us that history is full of examples of economic policies that were meant to be good, but ended up causing a lot of harm.
Right, because good intentions don't always translate into good results.
Exactly. Not when it comes to economics.
So a good understanding of these principles is crucial for avoiding those pitfalls.
Absolutely.
Now, even within economics, there are disagreements among experts, right?
Of course.
Like different schools of thought, debates, controversies. How does that square with the idea of economics being, a body of knowledge with principles?
That's a great question. Just like any other field, economics is constantly evolving. We're always learning new things, refining our understanding.
So it's not like a set in stone kind of thing.
No, but that doesn't mean that the fundamental principles are just a matter of opinion.
Right, there's still a solid foundation.
Exactly. The text draws this comparison to physics.
Okay.
Einstein's theories had very real consequences in the world.
Right, they weren't just abstract ideas.
Exactly. And while the effects of economic events might not always be as immediately obvious as, say, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the long-term impact of sound economic policies can be massive.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the Great Depression, for example.
Yeah, perfect example.
The widespread poverty, the suffering, that was a direct result of, economic forces.
And on the flip side, when you get economic policy right, the impacts can be hugely positive.
Right, it can be transformative.
The text mentions the reductions in poverty in India and China after they implemented certain economic reforms.
Oh, okay.
Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. That's incredible.
Yeah, that shows the power of understanding these principles.
Absolutely. Economics is a tool for understanding cause and effect in these complex systems.
Right.
And we're constantly refining that tool, building that body of knowledge.
So it's not just theory, it has real, tangible effects on people's lives.
Exactly. It's about people's well-being, ultimately.
Now, to really drive home the point that these economic principles apply even outside of, traditional markets.
Right.
The text uses this really powerful example of a situation where money isn't involved at all.
Yes. The military medical team on a battlefield.
Okay.
Let's talk about a high-stakes situation. They're facing the most extreme scarcity imaginable.
Right. Limited doctors, nurses, medical supplies.
Right. And they have this huge influx of wounded soldiers coming in, all with different levels of injury.
So they have to make these incredibly difficult decisions about who gets treated first, who gets what resources.
Exactly. Who gets the limited pain medication, who gets surgery immediately, who can wait.
It's a matter of life and death. And it forces them to think about these core economic problems, even though there's no money changing hands.
Exactly. It's all about allocating scarce resources that have alternative uses.
So it really highlights the universality of these principles.
Yeah, it's not just about, buying and selling in a market. It's about making choices in any situation where resources are limited.
Right, and that takes us back to those middle-class Americans we talked about earlier, the ones who are just getting by.
Yeah, exactly.
They're facing those same trade-offs in their everyday lives.
Right. How do I spend my limited income, my limited time, my limited energy?
It's all economics, even if we don't always think of it that way.
Right. And I think that's the beauty of understanding these principles. They give you this framework for thinking about those choices.
So let's bring it all together. What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into economics?
Okay, so the key things to remember are, 1, economics is fundamentally about scarcity, the fact that we always want more than we have. 2, this forces us to make choices about how to use our limited resources.
Okay.
3, our standard of living depends on how productive we are, how well we can turn inputs into valuable outputs.
Okay.
And finally, It's so important to understand the incentives and the consequences, the unintended ones especially.
Of our economic
Yeah,
decisions, because those are often more important than our good intentions.
absolutely.
And these aren't just like theoretical concepts, right?
You know,
They shape the world around us, they influence our daily lives in so many ways.
exactly. These principles, they're the key to understanding everything from global trade to the price of, groceries at the store.
Right, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
So here's something to think about. Consider how this principle of scarcity plays out in your own life, beyond just your finances.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Think about how you allocate your time, your energy, your attention. Those are all scarce resources too,
Right.
and they all have alternative uses. How can understanding these principles help you make better choices?
That's a great question to ponder.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been fun.
I hope you learned something new.
I know I did.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Bye.